Hello and welcome to the second portion of Chapter 24, The Age of Industry for the American Pageant, which is an AP U.S. history book or a dual enrollment college history book or just a U.S. history book. Today we're looking at Trust Titan emergence all the way up through South in the Age of Industry. So let's get into it. We're going to be talking about how some of these moguls, these robber barons as they're called, these tycoons, amassed a fortune that the United States has never seen at that time or even since. These were the wealthiest, most powerful men in American history. They circumvented their competition. They used ruthless business tactics. They treated their workers poorly. They treated their customers poorly, all in the name of competition and making lots and lots of money. And so the methods that they'd use to create the monopolies were there was two. There was vertical integration, which was primarily used by Andrew Carnegie with the steel industry, and that's where you own every step of the process to your industry. And so for Carnegie, it was from the mining to the shipping to the smelting and the Bessemer process to produce the steel, all the way to the marketing. And so your money never went outside of the business. And so that's what's going on there. And then you have John D. Rockefeller, the oil industry that did horizontal integration. So basically, there's drilling of oil and there's marketing of oil, but oil refining, no matter what, at one point, Rockefeller owned 97% of oil refineries in the country. Any competitor had to go up and use Rockefeller. Both ways create a monopoly and lots of good fortune. And drive out competitors, and eventually both of them start, mixing the horizontal and the vertical integration by expanding their businesses even more. And so Rockefeller would ally with competitors that monopolize a given market, and like I said, he tried to control all oil refineries. They would also form a trust, which gave control. They would give companies, small companies, stock to a board of directors in Standard Oil. So they would trade stock, like I don't know, Mississippi Oil would trade stock with Standard Oil, 50 shares apiece. That's a very small amount, but Standard Oil is worth so much. These small companies thought that they were getting a good deal. Secretly behind the scenes, Rockefeller's lawyers or investors would be buying as much stock as they could, so they could manipulate and eventually get 51% of the shares, and then they would absorb that small Mississippi Oil into Standard Oil, and the corporation would go away. And the financing of all this was JPMorgan, who used the tactic of interlocking directorates, where he put people on the boards of directors of rival, he put his own people on the board of directors of rival companies, like a business mole or of some sort, which is very strange and pretty ruthless. So we have kind of a drawing here, an illustration from the book of how vertical integration worked. For the Ace meat industries here, they would raise the cattle, they would slaughter them, they would haul them in refrigerated cars, they'd have their warehouses, their meat packing plants, and then delivery wagons. Horizontal integration, all oil refineries are owned by Rockefeller. This is a political cartoon of the day called The Octopus. This is around 1903, 1904, showing just how much Standard Oil controlled the country, controlling two of the branches of government, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and they're going for the White House, the executive branch in the lower left-hand corner. And so let's talk about steel. Steel is the basic building block of the Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution. In terms of railroads, they're the main material used for the rails, for the building of skyscrapers in the cities, using a steel skeleton to build up instead of out. For bridges, you name it, steel is the basic building block of this Industrial Revolution. By the late 1800s, the United States was producing 1/3 of the world's steel supply, which is substantial. That's a pretty hefty amount of production. The Bessemer process, which was developed in Britain, it simplified the steel production process and reduced the price of steel. Before this, steel was very expensive and difficult to produce, so most corporations used iron. Iron rails, for instance, they were prone to warp and they didn't last as long. Steel was a better material, but it was too expensive and difficult. The Bessemer process, steel is an alloy, developed in Britain, like I said, and brought here. It involved blowing cold air on red-hot iron to ignite the carbon, and by doing that, it eliminated the impurities. It was cheaper, it was cost-effective, it was time-efficient, and it made steel very affordable for building factories and rails, and you name it. The steel magnate of our country is Andrew Carnegie. Some people pronounce his name Carnegie, which is very pretentious of them, and they probably say tomato and drive a Tesla, but we're normal people, right? He's a Scottish immigrant who came to America. He left the railroad industry to start his steel factory using the Bessemer process in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you're a football fan or a sports fan, you probably know that the football team is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Actually, their logo is modeled after the steel logo, and sometimes nicknames of sports teams make sense. They have a purpose and a location, unlike the Utah Jazz. Come on, Utah Jazz. There's not a lot of jazz clubs in Salt Lake City. Besides, go Nuggets. Here's Carnegie later in life. He made at one point up to a fourth, maybe all the way up to a third of the nation's steel in 1900. He sold his business. He retired in 1901 to JPMorgan and a group of investors for $400 million. That's in their money, not adjusted to inflation. That's a substantial amount of money. He wasn't well liked because of his unfair business practices, his attacks on labor. He was known for hiring Pinkerton detectives to attack striking workers and all-out violence and gun warfare. He did donate $350 million of that. Carnegie was famous that he would give any community that wanted to pay for the cost of the uptake and the maintenance and the operation costs, he would build a library for that community. He built over 2,000 libraries across the country during his philanthropy days. He also started Carnegie Hall, which is very, very famous. JPMorgan, by the way, took Carnegie Steel and combined it with other investment holdings and other businesses they had to form U.S. Steel, which was the world's first billion-dollar corporation, which now, fast forward over 100 years, in 2018, Apple was the world's first trillion-dollar corporation. And I think Amazon has reached that. I think Microsoft has, which that's substantial. A trillion is 1,000 billion. It's a million. It's just way too much money. This is a picture of J.P. Morgan. I probably should have had it on the slide before. Not a very nice chap. Looks like he's beating peasants with his canes. I'm not sure. He apparently had a skin disorder on his nose that made his nose purple, and people made fun of him. And he's just not a delightful character. Not somebody you'd want to sit down and listen to stories from and get a Werther's original. He's not very loving, it looks like. Here is John D. Rockefeller. We're going to talk about oil now. Oil, not just in Texas, actually. Oil was first drilled in Pennsylvania by Edwin Drake in 1859. I mean, you think oil, Texas, Houston Oilers used to be a football team, but Pennsylvania was where it originated. And if you think about some of the oil you can buy in the store, in the hardware store at Napa, you can buy Quaker State, which is a nickname of Pennsylvania, or Pennzoil. So things do make sense. At that time, it was refined into kerosene as a cheaper alternative to whale's oil to light your home. And so artificial lighting at night, kerosene worked really well. It was pretty clean. It was efficient. And it was very cheap. But then, that Thomas Edison came along with his efficient, long-lasting carbon filament light bulb, and people started using electricity. And so poor Rockefeller, it looked like, his reign maybe wasn't going to go as long. But for them, just at the time the electricity's arriving and people aren't lighting lamps anymore, you have the arrival of the automobile, Henry Ford and the Model T and all that. And so they quickly changed their refineries to make, instead of kerosene, they made gasoline. They also started their own filling stations, and so they made even more money for the Rockefeller Corporation. So John D. Rockefeller, born in New York in 1839, set up as the first oil refinery at age 26 in Cleveland, Ohio. That was the center of his empire. In 1870, he organized the Standard Oil Corporation. And by 1877, he controls 95% of the nation's oil refineries. So basically, if you're in the oil business, you're going to Rockefeller. And he was ruthless. He was awful. He would purposely lower his prices to lose money temporarily to drive out a competitor. And when they went out of business, he bought up their assets. We'll go into more of his business practices. That was a very common thing of many of these corporations, that they were so big and there was no regulation that they could purposely lose money for just a little while in certain sectors and regions to drive out competitors to acquire more shares of the market. Rockefeller also owned tank cars, mazes of pipelines, wooden barrels, you name it, all in the name of oil and profit. This is Rockefeller later in life. He later had the disease where you lose all your hair, and that's a wig. And By the time he retires, he's probably the most hated man in America because of his wealth, because of his privileges, and largely because of his business practices and his labor relations with his workers. And like I said, some of the things he did, he lowered his prices to put competitors out of business, pressured customers not to deal with his rivals. He threatened railroad companies if they didn't give him a cash rebate of say $10,000 to $20,000, he would ship with their competitors, which strong armed them into giving him cash back, these rebates, which the railroad companies weren't just going to, take that loss. They passed on that loss to the customers, the average American, by charging more, which riled up farmers, and you get the rise of the Populist Party and all that stuff. And it's also said that he hired the best arsonist money could buy. If somebody was particularly a difficult oil refinery or oil business that wouldn't sell out to him, it wouldn't go under, things might catch on fire. So he is the Fiastata. In 1882, he formed his first trust in New Jersey. New Jersey had very lax laws in terms of having monopolies. A trust holds stock in other corporations. It's basically like one board of directors that runs many different companies, like Disney. Disney owns ESPN and ABC and Marvel and Pixar and Star Wars and Disneyland and all that stuff. And pretty much they own you. You are a slave to Mickey Mouse. He owns you. So a group of companies ran by the same board of directors. They traded other companies' stocks for Standard Oil stocks. We mentioned that earlier. Soon they would control their company. And he was the world's first billionaire. That's in their money. When you could buy lunch for a dime. He had $1 billion, which is remarkable. I've seen rough estimates. If he was alive today, his fortune would be worth $200 to $300 billion, which that puts Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Bill Gates of Microsoft to shame, nearly doubling some of their fortune. Other trusts that came about, trusts or monopolies that controlled one aspect. You have the sugar trust, you have the tobacco trust, you have the leather trust, you have the harvester trust. Basically, trusts are bad if you're a customer because there's no competition. They can charge what they want, and they don't have to treat their workers well. And the government's not willing to do anything about it. This is a cartoon of Rockefeller basically looking at the government, kind of taking an eye on it because he's larger than the government. He has that much wealth and power. At one point, Rockefeller and his company was worth 1% of the GDP of the entire country, which is just remarkable. His holdings, 1% of everything produced in the United States, goods and services for a year. This is a political cartoon, a little older one from 1883. The rival barons of Cyrus Fields, Jay Gould, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Russell Sage being carried on the backs of workers. Their fat cat lifestyle. And if you look closely in the lower right, you see a hammer and a pickaxe, which almost makes a hammer and sickle. Almost a little subtle propaganda for communism. Watch out, the government come get you if you're a communist. There's some Standard Oil stock here. You can see the signature of Rockefeller in the lower right. That's probably worth a lot of money. So the gospel of wealth, how they justify this is the good Lord gave him his money, is what Rockefeller said. He was blessed. Carnegie came up with something called the gospel of wealth. Basically, that I am rich because I'm Carnegie, because I'm better than you. I am more fit. Applying the theories of Charles Darwin and natural selection and, evolution and all that was applied to society. And so most of the rich used the survival of the fittest to explain why they were successful and why poor people were poor, because they weren't as good as them. It's their fault. So social Darwinists argued they were rich because they were the most fit. Darwin never coins the term survival of the fittest. He doesn't apply it to society. It's later people that do this. Herbert Spencer is the guy that coins the term survival of the fittest. And so the government really is a plutocracy, which is government controlled by the wealthy. And you could probably argue it is still today. There's a good number of our politicians, our congressmen, that are millionaires. Our president right now in 2019 or 2020 is a billionaire, supposedly. And many of them, they come in rich. They're already wealthy when they are elected to office. Some of them come out a little more wealthy. I'm not sure how that happens. Who knows? The Constitution gave Congress the sole jurisdiction over interstate commerce. And so Congress is unwilling to do anything because they don't think it's their job and they're okay with it. They believe in laissez-faire economics. It's not getting involved with the economy. And so the regulation of these monopolies and these unfair business practices isn't coming from the federal government. The states try to regulate them, but the big corporations hiring lawyers and having substantial amount of money take them to court, and the courts routinely find in favor of the corporations, stating that basically that the states cannot regulate the economy. That is not their job. They don't have that power. The Constitution gives Congress the sole power over interstate commerce. Many corporations, large trusts, basically sought safety behind the 14th Amendment, arguing that corporations were actually legally people, which our Supreme Court found that, in the last decade, that corporations could contribute as much money as they wanted to campaign contributions to a campaign of a particular candidate because it was free speech. So Apple and Amazon has the same rights as you do in terms of free speech, according to the recent rulings by the Supreme Court. Some attempts to regulate this. The courts, like I said, usually sided with the businesses too. You do have the Sherman Antitrust Act passed in 1890, in July 1890, signed by Benjamin Harrison. That is John Sherman, the senator from Ohio. And if he looks a little familiar, he's the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman. The Shermanator, as I like to call him, the man who's notorious for supposedly burning Atlanta and all that stuff in the Civil War. It wasn't a strong law. It's more of just a symbolic law to try to help the people. It actually was used many times against labor strikes instead of against the corporations it was intended to. There was a particular strike, I believe it's the Homestead strike, I can't remember, that was broken up because they were stopping the shipment of mail. And so they used the Sherman Antitrust Act to stop a labor strike. It contained a lot of legal loopholes. It's really a paper-thin, very bad law that didn't really work. This is kind of the tale of two, America and the Gilded Age. You have the new rich, they're enjoying their parlor, and they have a servant, and they're playing chess, which is a very elite, very fun game, and they're, look at the decorations, they have books and lights and all that, versus an immigrant family, probably in New York here, and they are shelling nuts for extra money. And so they're being paid to basically take the shells off the nuts, bag them up, and give them to some salesman, and they're getting paid this to work out of the home. The little girl here, she looks like she's sneaking a little snack and probably not supposed to, and the baby in the corner definitely wanting some, but they're busy at work, and so it's kind of a tale of two societies in this country. Lastly, for this section, we have the South in the Age of Industry. As late as 1900, the South was still not producing as much goods in terms of industry as it had before the Civil War. In terms of the economy, the Civil War was a huge step back for the South. Agriculture received a boost, and so it was doing better in the 1880s when you had the machine-made cigarettes, which replaced handmade cigarettes. That really upset the Cigar Rollers Guild. There was a labor union of cigar makers. James Buchanan Duke made a fortune with his American Tobacco Company, with these machine-runs made cigarettes, and pretty much everyone smoked back then. You might have heard of James Buchanan Duke, his university, his endowment, still very famous, one of the most hated and beloved college basketball teams in the country. Obstacles that slowed Southern industrialization. Well, there's a lack of desire. You can make money in agriculture. Also, the Northern-dominated railroad companies actually charged more to ship from the South to the North than the North to ship to the South. And that's from the pressure of the steel industry and other corporations, and some other factors as well. There's not a lot of capital, not a lot of banking in the South. They don't have the money to invest. But they do have cheap real estate. They have cheap labor. And so there is a slow shift of industry into the South, largely into the textile sector. So you have a cheap workforce. You have the railroad boom. It's not as strong as the North. This isn't like the Northern Industrial Revolution, but there is some growth of industry in the South. Many wanted to create a new South. It was diversified. It had an economy that wasn't just based on agriculture, not just on cash crops, that had commerce and trade, and commerce and trade are the same thing, and industry and all those other things. Steel actually grows in the South after the Bessemer process. You have steel plants that pop up in Alabama, Birmingham, because they have coal and iron. There is steel production across the country, not just in Pittsburgh. Pueblo, Colorado was a major steel producer out west at one point. But the steel lords of Pittsburgh pressured the railroad companies to charge more for shipping Southern steel than Northern steel, and so there are some factors that hinder their growth. But the South excels in manufacturing textiles. The first Industrial Revolution, which was pre-Civil War, largely was the textile industries in New England, the factory system, and Francis Cabot Lowell and all that stuff. those were moving to the South because it made more sense. It was cheap real estate, cheap labor. They could actually pay their workers less in the South, and then you eliminate shipping costs. And so the South is doing, better in terms of manufacturing clothing and cloth. By 1903, the United States is still producing 60% of cotton, followed by India. You have Egypt, Egyptian cotton, ooh, super expensive. Or Russian cotton. I've never heard of Russian cotton. That seems made up. It's probably made of vodka, let's be honest. Chinese cotton and other cotton. These are women and children working in the tobacco factories. Businesses back then, it was routine to hire women and children because you could pay them less than men. And, a lot of people desperate for work had to pull their kids out of school or not send them to school to go make a living. This shows the spindles in New England versus the South. The number of factories spinning cotton in the North grows until 1920, and then it drops substantially. In the South, it grows till about 1930, and then it starts to go down by 1980 and into the modern times. Cotton manufacturing, or not manufacturing, but textile manufacturing is being done in third world countries. Real estate is cheaper. Labor is so much cheaper that the transportation costs to ship across the globe, it's still more beneficial and economic to do these industries in third world countries. That's all we have. Thank you for watching. If you have any comments or questions, put them in the comment. And if Shane, if you're watching in Canada, good luck for pulling for you at Coleridge.